Hi there, this is part 2 of my Elden Ring analysis. I recommend checking out part 1 before watching this video. The online of this game is broken. I'm not talking about the network issues, I'm talking about it from a mechanical standpoint. Just like previous Souls games, you need to use an item to interact with the online. In this game, it's the finger remedy. Doing this will allow you to summon co-op partners, duels, and invaders. Co-op partners can help you defeat enemies and bosses at the cost of giving enemies and bosses more health. Duelists allow you to have a duel with another player, and invaders can join your world randomly and fight you and other co-op partners. The first problem is that without activating the Taunter's Tongue, single players cannot be invaded, meaning that even with the finger remedy equipped, you then have to activate another item in order to be invaded whilst playing single player, to which there is no advantage. What this means for invaders is that most matches will be with players using co-op partners, which means you're likely going to be in gank matches where you get pummeled to death by 2 or 3 players at once. And it's also made worse by the fact that your items are halved when in another player's world, so invaders have every disadvantage and the chances of them facing a single player is much lower, since you need to get this item by going to the round table hold, jumping down and beating this guy just in order to bring invaders into your world without summoning co-op partners. Next, protectors are worse off in this game. The blue cipher ring allows you to be called into invaded worlds to help the host out, and the white one calls other players to your world if you need help. However, you need to buy these items first. In Dark Souls 3, you automatically get Way of the Blue, allowing protectors to come into your world just by progressing through the game. But also, since most invaders will be dealing with people in co-op, that means most protectors will be in matches with 3 other people taking on one guy, so the chances of a 3v1 or 4v1 are very high due to how the mechanics are done, which is why so many people are using twinking or smurfing accounts. In Dark Souls 3, the Ember gave you a health boost, so there was a reason to use it beyond multiplayer features. The finger remedy doesn't give you any kind of boost, so there's no reason to use it unless for co-op. Now, in terms of PvP builds, some can be insanely tedious to fight. I don't interact much with the online of these games, so I can't talk much about PvP builds, but what I do know is that every FromSoftware game with PvP has a lot of players with builds that can be extremely frustrating or unfair to fight, because years down the line, people know what builds work and which don't, and which builds can be seriously abused, so they use them, and then the PvP just becomes a bunch of broken build players fighting each other. That's kind of already happening to this game after a few months. Really, the only way I can see the PvP working in the game is with the duels, since most players using them will be doing a one-on-one, and you can even coordinate them with friends or other players, and thus you can have yourselves fighting on equal footing. Also, the network for this game is genuinely awful at times, and they need to fix that. I don't know why they didn't just use the Ember mechanic from Dark Souls 3, since it works completely fine, and would have worked completely fine with this game, since it means the chances of gank invasions would be reduced, and there would be a higher chance of encountering one-on-one invasions in your playthrough. Okay, so PvP and invasions are bad, but what about co-op? Co-op works fine in dungeons, but it doesn't work that well in the open world since it doesn't let you access your torrent whilst playing online, meaning you and your partners just have to run across open fields, and it can take longer than it should to traverse locations. Yes, it could be really irritating to be forced off your torrent when someone invades, but I'll take a minor annoyance over being forced to run a 5-minute journey that should have only taken 2 minutes. In dungeons, the co-op works much better because it's enclosed. Though what I do like is that activating co-op is the most accessible in any of these games. You just need to buy the crafting item from this guy and then pick flowers and then you can craft the item. And considering how many of these flowers are in the open world and the fact that they respawn, makes using online features extremely easy. Though since the online of this game is broken, who knows if you'll want to interact with it. To fix the online, just have it work the same way it did in Dark Souls 3. It wasn't perfect, but it worked much better. Level design has always been one of FromSoft's fortes. They have created a variety of different locations that have multiple vertical levels to them, with secret paths and NPCs hidden around the area that you can find. Elden Ring is no different in this regard. So let's start with the legacy dungeons. Stormveil Castle is amazing in this regard. The level starts off with a solid boss before then progressing to a gate. This NPC, Gostok, gives you two options on how you want to approach the castle. Either A, sneak around the inside of the castle and make your way to the next boss, Godric, or B, open the front gate and get blasted by a bunch of enemies you'll either need to fight or run away from. This already adds variety to how you play through this section. Option B is riskier, yes, but if you manage to pull it off, then you have a straight shot at the boss and can visit the lower sections of the castle faster than option A. However, there is much more danger involved by the fact that nearly every step of the way you'll be pursued by enemies. Option A is safer than option B, not because there's less obstacles to overcome, but because they're more manageable since you're not constantly being thrown into danger. Neither option locks you off from accessing certain sections of the castle, so you're not locked out of exploration no matter what you do. Aside from that, Stormveil has a central point being the Rampart Tower, which acts sort of like a hub for Stormveil since it leads to a lot of locations in the castle and many areas link back to it. There's even secret locations and encounters if you explore and keep an eye out. Plus the jump button adds a lot more than just combat options. You now have some minor platforming, which means levels can now be more creative in how you scale them vertically. Stormveil is a really strong location in the game, and considering it's one of the locations that many players will visit early on, it sets a good impression for the rest of the game. Re Lucaria Academy also succeeds with flying colours. It has a variety of different location types, such as graveyards, rooftops, and academy halls, and libraries to give itself plenty of visual variety as well. It also has a mixture of different ways to progress through the level and secret rooms and items. Though there's not as many shortcuts here or as much looping around, so your progression through the level will mostly be very linear, but it does that very well. Though I do think the amount of enemies in the areas can be a bit much. Having 5 different wizards constantly spamming magic projectiles at you can make it a bit tedious for the player to partake in combat. Volcano Manor is accessed by either dying to a specific enemy in the academy or by finding a secret wall in the manor itself leading to the lower levels. This level is very linear for the most part. It's sort of shaped like a circle that you need to loop around in order to raise the bridge, giving yourself a way back to the Grace, which then leads to a boss fight and then to the next area, which is a linear section of rooms that you go through until you fight the next boss. It's not like Stormveil where it's a multi-layered level where things loop back around together. It's more like a linear level with diverging paths. The enemy placements are done very well so that the players can predict where enemies are going to come from, and as you progress through the level you'll encounter more and more difficult enemies and a mixture of different challenges, which makes up for the linearity. Leyendell Royal Capital is very different from the other legacy dungeons in the game. The way most of them work is being different sections of the same dungeon that link together. This is technically true for Leyendell, but it's more like one big city that the player traverses with small rooms or sections to explore in between moving through the city. Plus it has an entire sewer level underneath with its own boss that you could completely miss. The sewer itself is similar to Undead Parish from Dark Souls 1, where it has gates blocking you from progressing, so you need to find another way around, and then you can get onto the other side of the gate and open it up, giving you a much quicker and more convenient way to traverse the area. My complaint with this area though is that since it's so big, it's far too easy to avoid combat or just run past enemies and get to where you want to go. Now yes, you can run through Stormveil, the Academy or Volcano Manor, but it is more challenging to do so because of the enemies and challenges in the environment you encounter, especially during areas that are narrow. But since Leandol is so big, you can just run through everything. Maybe there just aren't enough enemies populated in the city? There's just not much reason to engage in combat other than for runes or just because you want to. In fact, depending on your level, it can be really hard to combat some of the enemies in Leandol, so your best bet is to just avoid combat altogether. More could have been done to encourage combat. Bloodborne had big streets and cities such as Yharnam, but they were populated enough to make running through them a challenge, and they were narrow enough to make maneuverability difficult, but not impossible. Considering how populated the lands between is, I don't see why they couldn't have made a linear section more populated. I do like the look of the area a lot though, especially with the giant dragon laying in the castle, giving some scale to the place and also making you think about its history and what it's been through. When you return later in the game, the city has been buried, which I do like the look of, but it just erases an entire city level that you can't go back to, now just turning it into a barren wasteland that you can traverse in a straight line to get to the end of the game. It fits story-wise, but it negatively impacts gameplay. Plus, it locks you off from some sections for the sake of it. Crumblin' Fara Missoula is an interesting one for me, because visually it's my favourite area in the game. In terms of level design though, it's my least favourite. There's not many branching paths and the level is very linear in terms of progression. Most of the time you'll just be moving from room to room killing enemies. There's not much use of platforming or unique traversal types. About the most you'll get is this hidden boss. The issue is that the best legacy dungeon in the game is Stormveil, and the quality gradually decreases as you progress through the game instead of getting better, and I have no clue as to why you would design your game that way. Why start off at your best and then work towards your worst? Shouldn't it be the other way around? When the first legacy dungeon of the game is Stormveil, it sets the expectation that every legacy dungeon following it will be on par in quality. But they're not. They get slightly worse each time. Crumblin' Fara Missoula isn't bad by any means. It's extremely well polished with fair enemies and clear and understandable progression, but it's just an odd decision to have the weakest level in the game be the final legacy dungeon of the game. Miquella's Halleck tree is amazing. It starts off with you traversing tree branches similar to the Great Hollow in Dark Souls 1, as you find these structures laid about the branches, which offers different paths to go and also shortcuts back to areas. There's then a boss fight, and then you make your way down to the side of the Halleck tree, which gives you two different paths leading in the same direction, with different enemy types and challenges on both. There's not as many secret locations, but the overall design and the way the player progresses through the dungeon is very unique from any other location in the game, and considering that it's a secret location in of itself, the fact that FromSoftware went to this much effort is appreciated. Overall, the legacy dungeons in this game are fairly well designed with a good mix of enemy placement, different challenges for the player to overcome, secret locations, branching paths, and different ways to progress, making them ripe for multiple playthroughs. What's also great is that you can tackle most of these dungeons in whatever order you want, just like the open world. There's clearly an intended order in which to do things in, but there's nothing stopping you. You can go to Leandol from the start of the game. It's not ideal, but you can, and this in of itself adds replay value to the game. There are also dungeons that run under the main map, and these are all great and unique too, but I believe there's a missed opportunity here. The map of Elden Ring is shaped like a circle, but there's one part missing, and the ocean takes up a big portion of that circle. So if you wanted to get from Caelid to Leandol, you would have to go through the Limgrave, Lorania, and then the Altus Plateau in order to get there. I think exploration could have been improved if the underground areas was under the ocean part of the map, and using the underground you could make shortcuts from one part of the land to the other, sort of like a subway system in a city. But then again, since there is an overabundance of graces in the game and you can fast travel, there's not much reason to do that when you can just teleport. It's why I think FromSoftware should have cut down the number of graces in each area, that way the player would be encouraged to traverse and get from areas more. Though fast travel should still definitely be a thing. Most of the other dungeons are bite-sized compared to the legacy ones, but can offer unique gimmicks or fights to be memorable or fun to play through in their own right. The enemy design in this game is pretty good overall, and their placement is good too. There's not too many situations where you can get ganked unless you're careless. Most of the enemies have well-telegraphed attacks, and a variety of melee moves, spells, incantations, and different movesets to make each area a unique challenge. Though there can still be some enemies which are annoying to fight. For the most part though, the enemies work well with the levels they're placed in. So overall I don't have many complaints when it comes to level design in this game. The boss design in Elden Ring is extremely mixed. Some bosses in the game fit extremely well with the game's mechanics, and then there's others that are ridiculous. Now I've already talked about the repeated bosses problem, so I'm going to talk more about the bosses' design themselves. Margit the Fell Omen works extremely well as a starting boss to the game. His moveset is telegraphed very well, and he has a mix of charge up and delay combos to keep the player on their toes. He gets a lot more aggressive in his second phase, but not so much to the point where it becomes difficult to play aggressive yourself. My only complaint would be this quick sword move here. This attack happens right after a different combo Margit does. The timing on the attack is completely fine, the problem is that he doesn't do it consistently. Sometimes he will do the attack, sometimes he won't. So you might try and attack him after finishing one attack, thinking he's left open only to then get hit, or you'll back off anticipating the attack only for him to not do it, and then you just wasted an opportunity to punish. Apart from that though, his mechanics work very well with the player's combat mechanics, and it allows for different playstyles, whether it be pure melee, a mix of spells, or long-range combat. You fight him later as Morgott the Omen King, and whilst he is a reused boss, his moveset completely changes when you fight him again. His attacks are faster, he uses different attacks, he has more AoE attacks, and in general is more complex and more challenging. I don't mind a reused boss so long as they're done like this, where so much is added or changed to the point of it almost being a new boss in of itself.
I command thee, kneel! I am the Lord of all that is golden.
Godric the Grafted also works really well. He's much faster and more nimble, and has really powerful special moves that can cripple you, but they're all really well telegraphed. Except for this wind move. He can do it at any time, it's very quick and can stagger the player very easily. So it can make the player want to play more reactionary and wait for Godric to make his move before doing anything. His second phase gives him a dragon arm which allows him to do fire attacks and more area of effect attacks, adding more variety to the boss overall. If it wasn't for the wind move, then I'd say the boss is perfectly fine, and can be a very challenging and memorable boss for many early game players. Many playstyles are viable, but due to him being aggressive and pretty fast, you have to be very considerate of when to do specific attacks. Plus, I really like his theme. Red Wolf of Radagon is a wolf with a sword in its mouth that runs around very quickly, attacks very quickly, and can use summon swords to attack you from range. The only problem is that this boss doesn't play well with slow playstyles, such as greatswords, because of how fast he is, and he can also stagger you very easily. So when fighting this boss, it's better to use a fast and adaptable playstyle, rather than one that's slow but deals heavy damage.
Foul trespasser. Send word far and wide. Of the last queen of Caria, Renala of the full moon. And the majesty of the night she conjureth.
Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, has a first phase which is reminiscent of the Deacons of the Deep boss in Dark Souls 3, where you look around for the right target, take them out, and now you can actually deal damage to the boss. That's it, it's a very gimmicky first phase. Her second phase transports you to a moon river. She uses sorcery attacks against you, meaning nearly all of her attacks are projectile based and can be dodged with good timing and positioning. She also has little to no poise, so she staggers very easily when attacked. Her advantage is at long range and her disadvantage is at close range, so she'll often back away from you or attempt to stagger you to get away. When you get her health down enough, she will use spirit summons to attack you, but also mainly to distract you and use it as an opportunity to get away from you. My only issue would be that I wish she had more health. Now, to be fair, I was overleveled when I reached the academy, so keep that in mind, but because of that she doesn't pose as much of a challenge. But at the same time, I don't think that devalues the rest of the boss's design. Her attack style is unique from any other boss in the game, and her area is very memorable. Plus, her theme adds to the magical visuals you're witnessing.
Remedy. Together we will devour the very core.
Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy's boss fight is based more on spectacle than actual mechanics. It works very similar to Yhorm, the giant from Dark Souls 3, in that there's a weapon specifically made for killing him, and that's the intended way to fight the boss. I think this fight is better though. The player has way more moves to play around with on the weapon, and it doesn't do as much damage as the Storm Ruler in Dark Souls 3, so you get to spend more time actually playing with the boss and its moveset. The boss accomplishes what it sets out to do: improve upon the style of a boss from previous games, whilst providing stunning visuals for the player to look at whilst fighting the boss.
General Radahn is cursed ever to wander. Eaten from the inside by Melania's scarlet rot, his wits are long gone. Now he gathers the corpses of former friends and foes alike, gorging on them like a dog.
Starscourge Radahn is where things start to fall apart though. This boss has a gimmick in that you can summon a lot of the NPCs you've interacted with and have them fight alongside you in the battle, which makes this fight unique against all the others in the game, since it's an all-out war against Radahn. His attacks are super damaging to the point that a lot of his attacks are either one-hit kills or two-hit kills, and he's so aggressive that trying to land a hit before he does is extremely risky to the point of almost being unviable. So either you play reactionary where you wait for the boss to attack before doing damage, use ranged attacks, or wait for the NPCs to kill the boss. I don't know why the damage has to be so extreme. The aggressiveness of the boss is enough to already make it challenging. You don't then need to make most of his attacks a one or two hit kill on top of that.
Upon my name as Godfrey, the first Elden Lord.
Godfrey the First Elden Lord is my favourite boss in the game. He has the same issue as Radahn where his attacks do a lot of damage, but he is far less aggressive and has much more punish windows to allow for the player to deal damage. So whilst it's still a problem, it's not as prevalent or as unfair. He has a variety of attacks such as AoE, launch attacks, delay attacks, and swipe attacks, which you can counter and dodge in different ways. You do fight him again towards the end of the game, but now he has new moves and extended combos that he didn't have before. In his second phase, his stomp will now cover the entire area, which would seem unfair, but considering dodging gives you iframes and you can block it, it's very reasonable to avoid. In his third phase, he becomes Horelu, and his mechanics completely change. He ditches the axe and just goes straight into brawler mode. He is much faster and much more aggressive. The only thing I don't like about this phase is this billion hit combo, which he does, and it's extremely difficult to avoid if he starts it whilst you're at close range combat. Otherwise, his attacks are fairly well telegraphed, with them either being charged up or being slow enough to dodge incoming. He's mostly well balanced and allows for different playstyles while still having a lot of variety himself. Fire Giant has you attack his leg in the first phase while he tries to repel you from it with different fire attacks such as projectiles, AoE, and tracking explosions. It works well for the most part, however it can be difficult at times to tell what attack the giant is doing since he's so big and the camera doesn't fully display him, so you have to get used to animations on his lower half telling you what he's going to do. During his second phase, he's now on all fours, which allows the camera to display him better. His moves are all really well telegraphed and the variety of attacks will require you to adapt to the situation very well, as choosing when to run away or run towards him. The only problem is that the boss has so much health to it, and so it can drag it out for way too long. But then again, I could have been underleveled before facing him, so that may be on me. Otherwise, he's really good. The Godskin duo are terrible. First of all, it's just a reused boss with no new or unique elements, it's just two bosses stuck together. Now, FromSoftware has done 2v1 bosses before, but the reason Ornstein and Smoke worked is because of how their attack styles complemented each other. Both movesets were completely different and was the complete opposite of one another, but they made up for each other's weaknesses. Smoke was slow and Ornstein made up for that. Ornstein was very punishable and Smoke made up for that. And depending on which one you beat first, you would then face a superpowered version of the other boss in the second phase, which added strategy to who you would take down first. The Godskin duo don't complement each other as well. First of all, their movesets are very similar mechanically, both have very quick attacks and can catch the player off guard very quickly. The timing for both is very similar too. The only real difference is their super moves. The Godskin Noble has this attack where he bloats himself out and then rolls around the area for a good 10 or so seconds, which I find funny, but the player has to be constantly dodging this incoming attack, whilst the Godskin Apostle can do any of his attacks. So you're super vulnerable when he does this attack, and unreasonably so. Plus there isn't any reason to use target prioritization, since if you kill one, they'll just come back in the fight later. If you manage to kill both at the same time, they'll just respawn like 10 seconds later anyway. So there's no evolution to the fight. It's very lazy, and I hate using the word lazy when talking about video games considering how difficult it is to make one, but taking two existing bosses, slapping them together in a 2v1 fight, and then calling it a day is lazy. You just keep killing them until the health bar reaches 0 and then boom, you beat the boss. The issue here isn't difficulty, the issue is that FromSoftware is doing a worse variation of ideas they did a decade prior. They even managed to do a free-for-all boss in Dark Souls 3 that worked very well, which is why this boss here is disappointing to me, because I know FromSoftware can do this sort of boss very well. Malekith the Black Blade is ridiculous. In his first phase, he's the Beast Clergyman, a mix of different attacks such as swipes, projectiles, and AoE. though he does have a problem with 2 successive attacks which are very hard to dodge. Some enemies in Elden Ring have this issue, where they will do 2 successive attacks that happen so quickly that your options are to either dodge the first hit and take the second hit, block both attacks leaving you either staggered or with low stamina, tank the first hit and dodge the second, or if you position yourself just correctly then you can dodge both. But that last situation almost never happens. Basically, you need to be anticipating attacks and react to them before they happen, which is stupid design. I should just be able to see what the boss is going to do and then be able to react to it myself. I should not have to be playing guessing games of, is he going to do that attack? I should just be able to tell if he's going to do it. Now, the anticipation playstyle isn't an invalid way to play the game, but I shouldn't be forced into playing the game that way. But these issues are child's play compared to his second phase. In his second phase, he becomes Malekith the Black Blade, and his design looks awesome. In fact, all the boss designs in this game looks cool, but this one's my favorite because the armor reminds me of the Berserker armor from Berserk. Anyway, in his second phase, he starts jumping around the map like a teenager who just shotgunned 4 Red Bulls back to back and shoots projectiles at you. This works. What doesn't work is the fact that he spends so little time close to you that trying to do this boss melee instantly puts you at a major disadvantage. Because you have to wait for him to come to you, and oftentimes, even then, it's still not viable to attack. He does this move where he crashes into the ground, and it does heavy damage, and most players will think, oh, here's an opportunity for me to punish him. Nope, he then bombs the surrounding area, damaging you if you get close to him. Also, if his projectiles hit you, then your health slowly ticks down for a short time. If you want to have a hyperactive, hyper-aggressive boss that jumps around and does all this crazy stuff, then sure, but you need to balance that out by giving him a weakness, because otherwise I'm encouraged to do long-range combat because I can safely and reliably attack the boss even when he's far away. The bomb attack and the blade kamikaze really discourage attacking him at close range. I was very disappointed with this boss. At least his theme is cool. Morg the Omen is really good. He has a variety of attacks and is quick and nimble, but still telegraphed enough to dodge and can set fire to the floor, which adds a challenge of positioning since he's limiting where you can move in the fight, similar to Chaos Witch Q-Lag. So overall he's a very solid and unique boss, pretty challenging too. The issue is that he's reused as Morg Lord of Blood, and this boss is bad. First of all, it has this scripted event where the more you damage him, he steals health from you, and you can't avoid this by the way, until he reaches his second phase, where he starts doing large sweep and AoE attacks in a narrow area that doesn't fit the mechanics of the game very well. So this boss is half good because one encounter with him is very well designed, the other isn't. His theme is really imposing and epic, which adds to the tension of the fight, however.
Heed my words. I am Melania, Blade of Mikola. and I have never known defeat.
Melania, Blade of Miquella, is where we really run into some issues, or mainly one problem. So the boss is a sword duel, and it's mostly great. A mix of different attacks with combos, evade swipes, stingers, and all sort. To mix it up though, she has the rally system from Bloodborne, where if she hits you then she gets health back, so taking damage now has 2 negatives towards it. So then what's the problem? This move. This move breaks the boss. It's a triple flurry attack that is almost impossible to dodge at close range unless you are very good with timing. The only reliable way to avoid it is to start running away the second she does this pose, which will allow you to avoid the first 2 flurries and then you can easily dodge the third. This attack happens so quick and does so much damage that it's unviable to be so close to her at all times. If you hesitate for a small window of time, or if you're too close to her when she starts this attack, you're going to have to dodge it, and good luck doing that. It gets worse in the second phase because she now gets 2 more attacks which ruin the boss even more. This attack, where she hits the ground and blooms Scarlet Rot over the surrounding area, means you're unable to attack her from close range until her attack is finished, which takes around 10 to 20 seconds. And this attack, where she sends out phantoms to kill you, lasts for around 10 seconds before then going for the kill. If these 3 attacks weren't in this boss, then it would work perfectly. But unfortunately, they're in the game, this is how the game launched, and they ruin an otherwise amazing boss. Because at many points during the boss, you're in a position where you either can't attack her at all, or can only attack her from long range, which is very bad design. At least her theme's good. Radagon of the Golden Order is an amazing boss. Every attack is telegraphed very well, he has a wide array of different attacks to provide variety, he does a fair amount of damage with each of his attacks, and it has multiple viable playstyles. In his second phase he starts teleporting around, which can disrupt the flow of combat a bit, but you can work around it so it's not a big issue. He's very challenging too, and he should be considering he's the final boss of the game. And I love how his theme is a remix of the main theme of the game. He's a very good boss, but he's not actually the final boss. You fight the Elden Beast right after Radagon, and unfortunately this boss is not as good. Now I don't actually have a problem with the Elden Beef stew. Now I don't actually have a problem with the Elden Beast's moveset. All of the attacks are unique and require you to avoid them in diverse ways. The only attack that is outright unfair is this orb that tracks you for like 20 seconds straight whilst doing damage to you, so you need to be constantly dodging or running away from it. Meanwhile, the beast itself can be performing other attacks. In fact, the beast can have multiple attacks active at the same time, sometimes making it extremely difficult to avoid or tell what's going on or what attack he's going to do next. But worse than that, it keeps moving away from the player all the time, so once again you're in a situation where you can't deal damage to it for long periods of time unless you're using ranged attacks. A way they could have fixed this was to make the beast more of a tank, where its attacks are an absolute powerhouse, but it's very slow and thus very easy to punish if you get good at avoiding its attacks. But that's not the case here, and since this is the final boss of the game, more should have been done to refine and polish it. I do like the setting though, with multiple Erd trees in the environment. It reminds me of Ash Lake from Dark Souls 1, and his theme is completely different from Radagon's. Radagon is meant to be this epic final fight, and the theme reflects that, whereas the Elden Beast is meant to be you witnessing a cosmic level creature existing beyond what should be capable of this universe, and the theme is meant to reflect that awe and fear. In terms of some of the other bosses, I'll run through them quick. Lich Dragon Fortisax uses red lightning attacks and has very well telegraphed attacks and patterns that the player can get used to. Dragon Lord Placidusax keeps darting around in his second phase, so that trying to melee him becomes a hassle. Regal Ancestor Spirit is pretty decent in terms of attacks, but has too little health, so the boss is over before really anything can happen. Astal, Naturalborn of the Void, has really bad hitboxes, making it really hard to hit him anywhere but the face, and his grab attack hitbox is stupid too. Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing is basically just an NPC battle, but a more powerful NPC, so there's not much unique to him other than the character itself. And those are the big boss fights in Elden Ring. The rest of them are just reused bosses or common enemies turned into bosses. And a lot of them suffer from the same problem of either being too aggressive, thus limiting melee playstyles, too much damage, thus discouraging melee playstyles, spending too long away from the player, thus encouraging long-range combat, or in some cases, poorly telegraphed attacks. I don't know why FromSoftware designed the bosses this way. The thing is that if this game had Sekiro's combat mechanics, then these issues wouldn't exist, because Sekiro can adapt very well to aggressive or heavy damaging enemies, as well as enemies that jump around the map and do crazy stuff. However, the game is using an updated version of Dark Souls 3's combat mechanics, which still do not have as much versatility as Sekiro. Which is fine, because in Sekiro, the variety comes from the combat mechanics, whereas in Dark Souls it comes from different builds. However, most of these bosses just don't work with this combat system, and I don't see how FromSoftware didn't recognize this too. And if they did, why didn't they fix it? Were they pressed for time or resources? The thing is that most of the problems with these bosses can be fixed with relative ease. You wouldn't need to rework the whole boss. Just remove some attacks, or the effects of some attacks, and tweak the aggressiveness of the boss, and then bam, you can fix most of them. But even if FromSoftware does do this in future updates, I don't really care. This is how the game launched, this was my first playthrough of the game, this was my first experience with these bosses, and it was soured by bad design. Which is a shame, because the last 3 games FromSoftware developed contained especially amazing bosses. I really want to know what happened here, and it's so odd because almost everything else in Elden Ring is outstanding in quality, but the bosses tank the quality by a lot. FromSoftware has always had a very indirect way of telling their stories in games since Demon's Souls. Whilst there are cutscenes and exposition, the bulk of the storytelling is done by item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling. Some have criticized this style of storytelling, as if you were to not pick up or read some items, you would have little to no understanding of certain key plot details. You may not even understand anything about the story whatsoever. Sekiro had a bigger emphasis on story than any previous Souls-like game, but even then, FromSoft's style of storytelling still remained in the game. Many have praised this style of storytelling formula though, as it encourages the player to explore the game world and replay the game to do different paths and get more of the story, rather than just passively consuming the story through cutscenes. Now, I think it's fair to say that Elden Ring is the most story-driven Souls-like game yet by FromSoftware, and that's no surprise when you have one of the most acclaimed fantasy writers working on your project. Of course, you would want to put a bigger emphasis on the plot. The nice thing about Elden Ring is that despite lifting a lot of mechanics from Dark Souls, it is a new IP, so it doesn't have to be constrained by the lore of previous games. It's a new world with new characters, and a new setting. The logo for the game, and the symbol that you'll see throughout, is that of the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring was created by the Greater Will, which is an outer god. Outer gods are powerful beings that don't take physical presence in the world, but they still have influence over it, and you can see many of their creations in the Lands Between. It's another attempt at cosmic horror by FromSoftware. The idea that there are beings so powerful beyond imagination that by comparison you're a small ant. And that's always been a staple of cosmic horror, and that's exactly what the Outer Gods are. Queen Marika had help from the Greater Will to become the ruler of the Lands Between, in which she was given the power of the Elden Ring, which contains great runes that represent order, which is a common theme in the game. Marika eventually met her consort Godfrey, and together they had 3 children: Godwyn the Golden, Morgott the Omen King, and Morg, Lord of Blood. Both Godfrey and Marika expanded the influence of the Greater Will across the Lands Between. During this time, Radagon of the Golden Order became known as a champion who waged war against the Academy with his Golden Army. However, neither side won, and he instead decided to marry Queen Rennala, who led the Academy. Together they created General Radahn, Praetor Rykard, and Lunar Princess Ranni. Eventually, Marika decided to exile Godfrey once he had fulfilled his purpose, and Radagon left Rennala and married Marika instead. It also turns out that Radagon is actually the male half of Marika. Both of them are separate entities, but they're also one and the same in terms of goals. So Marika basically married herself. Due to this breakup, a lot of family drama was created. During this time, Godwyn the Golden was killed by the Black Knives. It's hinted that Ranni was responsible for this, but that hasn't been confirmed. Unable to cope with her son's death, Marika shattered the Elden Ring, which kept order in the Lands Between, as she hoped it would break the laws of life and death and would bring Godwyn back to life. By doing so, however, this severed both her and Radagon's connection to the Greater Will, and they were both imprisoned in the Erd Tree. What came next was Radagon and Marika's children fighting battles with each other so that one of them could become Elden Lord and rule the Lands Between. The Greater Will then called upon Tarnished, who had been exiled from the Lands Between, such as Godfrey, the Gold Mask, Fia, Gideon Ofnir, and the player, to help restore the Elden Ring to its former self, thus leading to the events of the game. In terms of backstory, Elden Ring is easily the most complex one FromSoft has done yet. It's also a more personally involved story by the fact that it's a story about family drama. It has unique character motivations, conflicts, and relationships, combined together with warfare against gods and the shattering of a once great land. The story in the game itself is rather simplistic, just like every other Souls-like game. The player awakens and fights through a series of bosses related to the world of the game until they become Elden Lord. This is mainly because when you start Elden Ring's story, the plot is almost finished. You're basically at the last quarter or the last third of the plot. Practically all the important world and character events occurred before you hit the start button. Now, once again, some may criticize this design choice, as many would say that the backstory for the game is the most interesting part of the story, and you don't get to play through that or experience it, and that if you view the story just as the events the player plays through, then Elden Ring's story is just a Tarnished defeating demigods and then becoming ruler of a land, which in of itself isn't very deep or complex. And yes, I would agree that if you view the story of Elden Ring as just the events you play through from start to finish, then yeah, it's not very interesting or compelling. However, that's not what the game is trying to achieve, so to view it as such is unfair, I'd say. The game is trying to create one big world with storylines that connect to each other, and the player has the choice to see how they go through. The events that you're playing through is one big platform to connect these characters and their stories. You play through the game and uncover the truth, and then you decide how to go about things. If the story in the game was told more directly, or if you were to play through the events of the Shattering, then the game wouldn't be able to achieve the sense of mystery with the story that it wants to go for. And it adds a lot to the characters that you fight in the game, as their backstory that you uncover can often completely change the context or previous perception that players had of the character. Morgott fought and secured the city of Leyendal, which housed the Elden Throne. However, he was rejected from becoming Elden Lord himself. Since he couldn't rule the lands between, he wanted to make sure nobody else could. Thus, he cast a spirit of himself named Margit into the world, trying to prevent any Tarnished from taking the throne. It seems Morgott had an inferiority complex and couldn't handle the idea of being ruled over someone else or someone else being more powerful than him, which led to his demise when he tried to battle the player who was a more skilled combatant. It's clear that Morgott was eventually going to encounter a Tarnished seeking the Elden Throne, but instead of accepting his limitations, he decided to make sure nobody else exceeds his limits. It's the story of a man who was obsessed with power that he could never obtain, and that became his downfall. He died fighting for something he could never have. You shouldn't lust for such a thing and just accept that you will, and always have had, limitations, and you shouldn't stop others from progressing because of it. Although one criticism I do have with Morgott is how this impacts gameplay. The whole idea of him sending out a spirit of himself is interesting, but what if every boss you fought in the game was just a spirit of another boss? What if you didn't actually kill them? You don't know. When you kill Margit at the beginning, you actually see him disappear and die, just like every other boss in the game. Do you really want to open that can of worms, FromSoftware? Godric was an ancestor of Marika who was weak and was humiliated by Melania after insulting her. Due to his weakness, he decided to graft parts of other bodies onto his as a crutch, but in doing so disfigured his body. He was an ambitious individual, but he couldn't handle the fact that he too had limitations, and instead of accepting that, he went down a path of deforming his body, which proved to not even be worth it when the player was able to beat him. Sometimes as people we put our faith in the wrong ideas and will go to great lengths to achieve something that isn't reasonably possible. And that was Godric's mistake. Rennala waged war against the royal capital after Radagon left, but was eventually attacked by her own students, which is why you find her locked away in the library. She can be seen clutching the Amber Egg, which is an item that allows for rebirth in a new body. She's holding this because her daughter Rani killed herself and her soul inhabited the body of a doll so that her mortal body would no longer be under the control of the greater will, and so she could surpass the limitations of a mortal body. But Rennala wants her daughter back, and so she keeps the amber egg clutched, desperately trying to resurrect her daughter. Renala has been trapped in this library for who knows how long, after being betrayed by those she cared most for, and her lover leaving her, with only the hope of her daughter coming back to comfort her. It's tragic and one of the more saddening characters in the game. Though the uplifting side is that she's the only boss in the game that you don't actually kill, and from her you get the ability to rebirth, which can change out your stats if you're unsatisfied with your current ones. Malekith is the half-brother of Marika, who was sworn to protect the Great Rune of Death. However, with the death of Godwyn, a piece of the Great Rune was stolen by Ranni. Malekith was ashamed of his failure, and so he bound his blade with his flesh to prevent such a catastrophe from ever occurring again. Though by doing so he would have a constant sense of hunger and begin feeding on death roots, even hiring individuals to seek out death roots. His mind was so corrupted by the fact that he failed to protect the Great Rune that he ended up torturing his body so he would never experience failure again. He couldn't move past or accept his mistake. You should learn to accept failure, but not let that corrupt who you are. Radahn is the most heroic and nicest character in the game. He was a general who was a ferocious warrior. As a demigod, his power grew, and so did his stature. This posed a problem as he loved the steed he rode on, but due to him increasing in size and weight, the steed would eventually be crushed if he attempted to ride it, and he did not want to abandon the steed, so he decided to learn gravitational magic and challenge the gravity of the planet and the stars so he could continue to ride his steed. After you defeat him, you see the stars fly around now that they're no longer under his control, meaning that during the entire fight with him, he was not at 100% strength because he was challenging the very stars, all because he loved his steed. FromSoftware has done this type of situation before where you fight an extremely powerful foe in a weakened state. It's so you understand just how powerful they are. They're not at 100% strength, and they're still one of the most powerful beings in the universe. In the trailer for the game, you can also see him waiting for Malenia to reattach her arm before continuing the fight. He's a very honourable warrior. Unfortunately though, Radahn's mind was corrupted by Malenia after she infected him with scarlet rot, which is a parasite that eats at you from within, leaving Radahn as a mindless warrior that now roams the lands between. And she did this because the fight between him and her was brought to a stalemate. The fight with Radahn is a festival meant to honour him by giving him one last fight before his send-off, and I can't think of a better send-off to such an honourable fighter. Malenia fell into a deep sleep after being exhausted by her fight with Radahn and awaited the rebirth of her brother Miquella, though Morg ripped Miquella from the Halleck tree and decided to raise Miquella himself as a powerful child. Morg was an omen who was born with horns and wings, which was deemed as a curse, and thus he was imprisoned beyond Liendel. He eventually escaped after the shattering of the ring and was contacted by the formless mother Outer God, which gave him blood flame abilities. He then eventually recruited followers to fight for him. Now yes, it is messed up for him to steal Miquella, but he was locked away for who knows how long, and he just wants to be free and presumably have some sense of family. So whilst his actions are very questionable, it makes sense in character as to why he would do all this. Ranni wants to overthrow Marika and become the new lord, but is unable to take part in the war herself, and thus she has servants do her bidding, those being Blythe, Iji, and Seluvis. Seluvis barely tolerates the player, and only does if they serve under Ranni. Blythe is a servant of Ranni and is a very polite fellow, always keeping spirits high when progressing through either his storyline or Ranni's. His design is also a very clear reference to Guts from Berserk. He even does a similar pose in the trailer. You can also summon him for Radahn's fight, and he has a few words to say about Radahn afterwards, which is why his ending is very saddening. He was trapped in an Evergol by Iji because if he continues to protect Ranni and resist the Greater Will, then he will descend into madness. The Black Knife assassins then try to assassinate Ranni, but Blythe kills all of them, though since he is now descended into madness, he no longer recognizes the player and begins to attack the player, leaving you no choice but to kill him. You can tell E.G. about his death, and then he's assassinated. Seluvis also dies, leaving only you to protect Ranni. Ranni caused so many casualties, all because she wasn't able to do things herself. And that's part of why I love the lore for this game so much. They each have their own interesting storylines that often clash with another character's storylines, and they have unique motivations and personalities from each other. Which is why it's so interesting to read about all of them and then link the pieces together. Though, to contrast all the praise I'm giving the game, I'm going to talk about a character who's not only bland, but a missed opportunity. Melina.
Greetings, traveller from beyond the fog. I am Melina. I offer you an accord.
This is a character you meet very early on. Her backstory is a mystery, but she says that she wants to discover her meaning and existence in the world, and thus she assists you in becoming Elden Lord. She even gives you the torrent. However, that's pretty much all she does throughout the entire game. She doesn't appear much, you can talk to her at the Churches of Marika, and to be fair, you do get to understand more of Marika's character through these interactions, such as why she exiled so many from the lands between. It was to make them better warriors, and it's implied that she did this so she could one day challenge the Greater Will. The problem is, whilst this adds to Marika's character, it does nothing for Melina's character. The only significant thing she does over the course of the game is light the Erd Tree and then die, but depending on your choices, you can do that yourself if you inherit the Frenzied Flame. And if you do that, she then abandons the player.
You are no longer fit. Our journey together ends here. And remember, should you rise as the Lord of Chaos, I will kill you. As sure as night follows day. Such is my duty. For allowing you the strength of runes. Goodbye, my companion. Goodbye, Torrent.
Peace out, bitches.
There's also a few occasions where you can level up and it plays this animation of you holding her hand, similar to the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3. And I don't know why they didn't keep this as the default animation for leveling up, or just had Melina sit with you at the Grace whenever you rested at one. At least then the player would feel her presence more, and when we reached Leyendell, it would feel as if we've been on this big journey together. You can summon her for a few bosses, but that's pretty much the extent of her character. She doesn't discover who she is or the meaning of her existence, and we never learn anything about her over the course of the game. What a waste. FromSoftware could have had an interesting character dynamic with the player, where Melina occupies you for the whole game and fights with you over the course of the game, and as the game progresses, you and her learn more about the world, and she then discovers who she is, or we learn what her backstory is. Both you and her are practically fresh to this world and don't fully understand it yet, so you would be learning everything together at the same time and could even have a few interesting conversations with her. Then her sacrifice would have meant something, because this character I fought bosses with, explored the world with, helped learn who she was and her purpose, and who helped me level up across my journey, just died so I can progress. I mean, for example, in Sekiro, both Sekiro and Lord Kuro have a bunch of interesting interactions where you get to see them grow and progress as characters and how their relationship develops. Thus you have a connection to him throughout the game, and so the choice that you make in the middle, whether to side with him or your father, actually has weight behind it. And they could have done something similar with Melina, but right now she's just a missed opportunity. And it's a shame, because I like her design, she looks really cool. But the character herself just isn't very interesting or compelling. Before we get to the endings, there's one last opponent we face, and that's the Elden Beast. The Beast was sent by the Greater Will to meet Marika and form a bond. This powerful beast is just the hand of a much more powerful god that we have no conception of, and that idea is scary. Elden Ring's world and characters are surprisingly well fleshed out with unique motivations, character interactions, and effects on the overall plot, whilst also tackling themes about failure, family, lust for power, insanity, envy, and much more which players will relate to and find meaning from, similar to how many players found a lot of meaning from FromSoftware's previous work. And the style of storytelling that allows you to explore the world at your own pace and interact with the characters in your own way leads to a unique experience with the story each time you play, and the fact that you have to search for the details to everything makes the bigger picture more satisfying when you've pieced it all together. But if you do just play the game from start to finish, not interacting much with the world or characters, then yeah, you're not going to find the story or the world that interesting. And I don't really blame you for feeling that way. But if you do take the time to experience all of it, then you're in for a lot of unique stories that tie the world together, creating a new and mysterious fantasy world. Though it should be said that if you're not really into family drama stories, then this probably won't interest you that much. Now, let's talk about the endings. Elden Ring has 6 endings, although 3 of them are just variations on an already existing ending. So it's more like there's 3 endings, but one of them has 4 variations. The default ending is the Elden Lord ending, where the player restores the Elden Ring and rules the lands between. Personally, this is my least favorite ending because it's the most bland. Like, yeah, we fixed everything, and we rule the world now. I don't find it very interesting. The variations still have you become Elden Lord, but the world is engulfed by either Duskborn, a Fell Curse, or an Age of Order, which puts an end to every existing conflict. The next ending is the Age of Stars ending, in which Ranni removes the Greater Will's influence from the lands between, and also removes the Golden Order, forming her own order. She then marries the player, and leaves the lands between without a ruler for the first time in an age. The fate of the world in this ending is uncertain, so it could either be good or bad. But I find it more interesting than the Elden Lord ending, because the implications of what could happen to the lands between is interesting to think about. The Lord of the Frenzied Flame ending is my favourite. You become the Lord of Chaos and massively mess up the world. If Melina left you in your playthrough, then the game then ends with her saying that she's coming to kill you.
I will seek you as far as you may travel. To deliver you what is yours. Destined death.
Elden Ring is a game that will set a new standard for open-world game design with the variety of locations, activities, characters, side quests, enemies, and items the player can interact with all over the map. The amount of different weapons, outfits, secret areas, items, bosses, and different ways quests can play out gives the game a lot of variety and replayability if you trim the fat. Sadly, the game is let down by reused bosses and some bosses being outright poorly designed, and also how many builds are outclassed by magic ones, making effective playstyles bottleneck into ranged attacks. Also, the online systems are bad and need to be fixed. The game makes up for it definitely by having an incredible world full of memorable characters, stories and environments, as well as having an amazing soundtrack. But these are still problems nonetheless. Would I consider Elden Ring a masterpiece? Overall, I would say yes. It's a very flawed game, but it also excels in so many areas that very few or no games have matched. Which is also why the bad elements of the game annoy me even more, because if they weren't there, then this game would be perfect or almost perfect. I would love to have a sequel to this game or another game by FromSoftware that expands upon many of its ideas and design to the fullest, without making many of the mistakes this game did. Either way, there are very few times a game comes out as great as Elden Ring. Probably the last time I enjoyed a game this much was Doom Eternal, 2 years prior. So whilst I am very critical of the game's wrongdoings, just know that I would still consider it one of my favourite games of all time, even with all the flaws. And I love FromSoftware, so I'm excited for anything they work on next. I still prefer Bloodborne though.